Analysis of the temperature control variables, as you might suspect, is somewhat complex. So I'll try to explain this diagram as fully as possible. And if there are some of you that cannot see the diagram clearly, please move forward.
Hi, how you doing?
Fine, thanks.
So I was wondering if I could have a written copy of the proposal we sent out to Ajax.
Sure. What do you need it for?
Well, I've got to go out there and make a presentation of that proposal. And I was wondering if I could have written copies of both the drawings and of the tables so I can use them as visuals.
With respect to geologic planning, we need a plan exploration program. That program begins by defining objectives with their special considerations, etc. Determine the methods of exploration, for instance, air photos, infrared, side scan radar, geologic map.
And I'm afraid that many of you have viewed these and not recognized the fact that what you're really seeing are some very, very basic errors that are commonly made because people do not understand either the purpose or the criteria associated with good visuals. At the end of the last program, we were talking about an outline. That is, that we had taken all of the information that you've decided to use in making a technical presentation. You've got it very carefully organized. You end up with an outline. You're all set to go, with the exception of one more thing that needs to be done in reference to preparation. And that's to pay some attention to the graphics that you're going to use, or the visual aids, even to ask the question as to whether or not you're going to use any at all. Now, I want to give you a little background about my involvement, if you will, in the whole area of graphics. And to start with, I want to make it absolutely clear that I personally am not talented or skilled or even capable in the area of graphics. The only two things I can draw are a deep breath and a conclusion, and they're both shaky. But I've been forced by circumstances to have to pay a great deal of attention to graphics as a consultant to the technical industries. And it started back in 1961. I think at that time it was the first time I had ever directly worked with engineers in high-level engineering type presentations. And one of the things that I discovered was that the nature of the subject matter with which they were dealing required that they use some kind of graphic support. And as I watched presentations that were being made, I would say frequently to these, the engineers, I'd say, hey, there were times when you people were using visuals where I really didn't need one as a member of the audience, and there were times when I desperately needed a visual. And they said, well, okay, then tell us, when do you use visuals, or why do you use visuals? And that really was the first time that I ever paid careful attention to understanding the purposes of visual aids. Because if you don't understand the purposes, then you're very likely not to know when it is appropriate to use a visual. So where do you start? I think it's critical to start by understanding that the first and primary purpose of a visual aid is to augment the message. Now remember, we talked about technical presentations always from the point of view of you, the speaker, attempting to convey information to an audience. You, the human being, are still going to be and always going to be the primary conveyor of information. The visual is used to assist, literally a visual aid. Now, assist in what way? Well, I think if you were to take a look at an outline of a presentation that you're going to make, line by line, item by item, idea by idea, you ask yourself, would a visual make it easier for the audience to understand what I'm saying, or would it make it easier for me to explain what I'm saying if I had a visual to assist? Now, if the answer is yes to either one of those two questions, that's a point where you can use a visual. But remember, it starts with, will it help me? That is, will it help the speaker, or will it help the audience? It's still to aid the human-to-human relationship. Now, there's a second purpose, I think, to which you can use visuals also, and that's to focus attention. I think earlier when we talked about the idea of the weaknesses of an audience, remember we talked about the fact that they have limited attention span. Sometimes you can use your visuals in a way in which you are constantly shifting their attention to what you want them to think about or understand. Also, visuals can be used to take a lot of detailed information, for instance, and say, I want to strip away all of the detail except one thing. Out of a complicated schematic, for instance, one interrelationship is where you want them to focus their attention. The visual helps to kind of clear away things. Earlier on, we talked about the idea of generalization versus specifics in terms of how you develop ideas. Well, that's really what the visuals can do, too. That is, you have a general visual that assists in getting away from detail to get a bigger picture, and then you use visuals sometimes to get right down to the specifics. So where you want them to focus their attention is determined in part by the visuals that you use and vice versa. Now, one final point that I think needs to be made about the purposes of visual aids. There are times when a visual is used for straightforward clarification. If you are discussing configuration, for instance, to describe in words is always going to create some kind of a mental image on the part of the audience. The problem is that each member of the audience may have a different mental image. If you want them to understand what something looks like, then show them what it looks like. That's the point of the visual, to clarify the words that you're using. Use it also for such things as size, proportion, even color at times is important. Whatever it is that you're trying to make sure they understand, don't always rely on words. If there's any question whatsoever about whether or not they'll understand, then you use a visual. Now, I went back at some point along the line after having worked all of this out, by the way. I went back to the engineers and I said, okay, there it is. Your purposes are clear. Use it to augment the message, to focus attention, to clarify. They said, hey, good stuff. From that point on, I began to see a rather distinct difference in the presentations that were being made. I found that they were using visuals at the appropriate time. Unfortunately, that wasn't enough. I still would sit there as a member of the audience and look at it and say, hey, you know, there are times when, frankly, the visuals themselves are, frankly, lousy visuals. They're distracting or something else. And that led then to a second kind of concern. And that's a concern, if you know when and why you're going to use a visual, you still have to be concerned with what constitutes a good visual. Now, when we talk about the criteria that we use to evaluate visuals, I think there's a couple of things that need to be understood. One is that visuals are frequently used in written documentation. You know very well, of course, that when you make a proposal, for instance, to a company, you're going to have put together a book that's just massive details of all the technical things that are involved. They have many technical drawings, they have charts and tables and all the other things that appear in print. I have no criteria at all in mind for things that appear in print. Frankly, that is not my concern. What I'm concerned about is the kind of visual that is used when you're standing in front of an audience and either showing it on a chart or projecting it on a wall or something like that. And it's interesting to note that a good visual as it appears in print may not necessarily be a good visual when it is translated into a technical presentation. And frankly, that's an error that's made over and over and over again. People assume they've already done the visual work. There it is. Now they can just use that and project it or something else. And it doesn't always work. Now, the same thing as I think with the things like technical drawings, that is, the actual tools with which you work. I have no objection to how you do it in terms of engineering practice, but don't assume that a good drawing is necessarily a good visual when you're talking about a technical presentation. All right, now, with that in mind, let's talk about what are the standards or the criteria that you use to judge a visual in a technical presentation. Now, the first criteria is one I suspect everyone ought to know, and that is visibility. Now, you say, well, of course, you've got to be able to see it. I don't know how many times I have sat and critiqued presentations, or been a member of an audience, by the way, in which the speaker over and over again will say, now, I know you can't all see this, but, well, if he knows that we can't see it, why then show it to us at all? Do you have any idea what it does to an audience, by the way? When you have flagged something for attention by saying, now, this is so critical that we want to show it to you, and then they can't see it. I watched a presentation being done once, and the guy had a big, huge chart. That thing was about 5 feet across, about 3 feet deep, all right? And it was, I don't know what it was, had on it, by the way, it was covered with little boxes, all right? And each little box was connected with a line to another little box. And these were thin lines, by the way. They had been drawn with a camel hair brush that had but one hair, all right? Anyway, all the little boxes had numbers in it. For all I know, it could have been a wiring diagram for the entire Apollo space missile. The individual stood in front of an audience and was pointing to it in the process of speaking. And at one point in the presentation, stopped and leaned forward because he couldn't read what was on the visual. Now, he's 3 feet away from the visual, and he can't read it. Now, what about the audience? The audience was evenly divided between those who thought it was a gray card and those who thought it was a white card, because from an audience position, there's nothing on it. Now, recognize something to start with. Visibility is a critical factor. If you're going to show something to an audience, you've got to be absolutely sure that they can read everything that's on that visual. Visibility relates to the relationship between the eye and the visual. The second criteria, that of clarity, relates to the mind and the visual. That is, when you show something to an audience, can they immediately upon looking at it understand what it is that they are seeing? There was a marvelous little magazine printed, I'm not even sure it's in print anymore, it's called Ford Times magazine. Ford Motor Company used to put it out, and it was little things on, you know, where to tour in the United States and so on. In the back of that magazine, occasionally, they would have one of these photo quiz things, you know, where you take a super close-up photograph of a common object, and they'd say, guess what that is? Well, I'm telling you, an awful lot of people in the technical industries like that game. And they play it with audiences all the time. They put something up in front of the audience and they're literally saying, guess what that is? I bet you can't figure it out. Now, there's all kinds of ways it happens. Clarity, because there might be just too mixed up in terms of the visual itself. Proportion or size is not there frequently in visuals. Remember, whatever the audience thinks they see, the first time they look at a visual is what they're going to think they see from then on. I don't care how many times you explain it. Once you get that first impression or fix in the mind of the audience, that's what stays there. Now, the third criteria that is critical to understanding presentational visuals is that of simplicity. For years, I suspected that when an engineer made up a visual for a presentation, they were informed by management that if the master has any white space on it, fill it. All right, doesn't make any difference what you fill it with. You know, your name, the division name, your number, mail station, anything, but make sure that you don't waste any white space. I have seen visuals you would not believe being presented. They have just everything that could possibly be put on it is put on it. I want to go the other direction. Every time you set up a visual to be used in a technical presentation, you ask yourself the question, how much of this could be removed? Don't even ask if any of it can be removed, because the odds are it can be. We talk about word and phrase visuals later on. If you've got 5 words, try to reduce it to 2. That's really what simplicity amounts to. If you've got a drawing or some kind of line drawing in which you want information presented, and it's got a lot of other detail that you're not going to talk about, don't show it. If it isn't critical to the point that you're making, then it doesn't belong on the visual. Simplicity is critical. Now, one last thing, or one last criteria, then, if you will, for the visuals, and that is control. And control really has to do with kind of the physical control of the relationship between the speaker and the audience. We talked over and over again about the fact it's the speaker as human being relating to audience as human being that we're talking about. If a visual interferes with your control over that communication process that we talked about in the first program, then there's something wrong. The visual should never interfere with your personal capability of controlling the attention of the audience, the flow of information, and all the things that go along with that. So there's the criteria, and they're not all that difficult to deal with. Visibility, clarity, simplicity, and control. Now, we talked about these somewhat in the abstract, and I think maybe that there's an easier way to get at that. And I want to go on and start talking about the types of visuals that you might use in a technical presentation. When we talk about the types of visuals, remember, I can't possibly cover every visual that you might use in a technical presentation. So what I want to do is to touch on those that are the most common kind. And I think if you identify the one that appears most frequently in technical presentations, it has to be the word and phrase, or word or phrase visual. And that's strictly one that has a title and then some kind of words under it. If I look at those overall, I think I have a tendency to react most of the time to the fact that they are probably a little bit too much information. That is commonly what happens to them. Let's look at some examples. Here's a relatively typical word or phrase visual that is clear, and as a matter of fact is fairly limited in the amount of information, but frankly there's just too many words on it. We approach here almost full sentences, and I think it's best to try to reduce the number of words down to the absolute minimum. Remember, the speaker can say as many words as the speaker chooses. I mean, there's almost no limit to what you say. The visual is there not to be the primary provider of information, but to merely augment or support by adding bullet words, reminders, or whatever else is necessary. Now, this next one, we get a little bit closer to it. The only problem with this particular visual is the balance factor. Most of the wording is contained in the upper portion of the visual, and then the words that appear below are a little bit too jammed. There's not quite enough space. So this is just really a somewhat badly structured visual, although again the simplicity factor is there. The final one that I want to talk about is one wherein, even given the very long title of the visual, the rest of it is very good. There's simplicity involved in it. It strikes well at what is being said. The balance is reasonably good. If you can make a few generalizations about word or phrase visuals, first of all, understand that a word or phrase visual should contain no more than about a title line and then 5 lines of type. Well, 6 if you're forced. Well, why the limited number? Primarily for visibility purposes. If you're talking about an overhead or a 35mm slide or charts or anything else, unless you have an incredibly large screen or an immense chart, ultimately you're going to have to worry about how big the lettering is. And if you're working with a standard-sized visual, and if you have more than about 5 lines of print on it after the title line, the odds are pretty good to get the 6th, 7th, 8th on up to the 15th line, which I have seen on occasion. You're having to reduce your letter size down to the point where it becomes invisible. In addition, of course, the 5 lines or 4 lines or whatever you need to get it across helps with a simplicity concept. Now, how many words per line? That one's very easy. Try for 1. All right? 2 if the information requires it. When you start to get 3 words per line, I think you're running into a problem. You may be getting a little bit wordy. Now, the only exception to this, by the way, is a word or phrase visual, the purpose of which is to talk about the wording. If, for instance, you want to play around with the changes in a law, for instance, OSHA changes their requirements in one way or another, and you want to talk about it word by word, then you might want to put the whole paragraph up. In that case, though, limit the amount of the paragraph that appears on each visual. Instead of using one word or phrase visual that has a whole paragraph on it, use like 3 or 4 that splits it up. So again, your audience can always have the visibility that they need. Now, in the technical industries, I guess the second most common kind of visual that I see are graphs. All kinds, line graphs, bar graphs, all kinds of graphs, schedule graphs that people lay out, all kinds of them, and they're relatively common. They are the ones that can become incredibly complex. Take a look at this one. Now, can you understand? I know you can't read it, by the way, because of the amount of information that's on it, the print is so small that if you were to project that visual, you'd have to use a movie screen, all right, a standard theater screen, in order to make it visible to the audience. But it isn't that. There's too much information on it. It's just incredibly complex. As a matter of fact, this particular visual would probably best be about 5 visuals, each one of which adds another element of information to the graph. Here's another one that I think is a great deal better. Now, granted, there isn't as much technical information contained in it. But again, that's part of the secret of doing it. It has visibility, it has clarity, that is, you can look at the visual and understand what it's all about, and it has simplicity. There's nothing on it that isn't absolutely necessary to the point that's being made. The difference between the first and the second graph is that in the first case, an individual trying to do everything in one graph, and in the second place, just reduced it to the point where it actually gets the point across. Now, one last one on the graphs. This kind of line graph is typical of what one sees in industry. It has a very heavy lines that are involved in determining the positions that people want identified, and it's very, very easy to read. It's clear in terms of the content, it's very limited in scope, and it does the job it is designed to do. Now, another one that we see quite a bit is what we call tables, or sometimes called laundry lists. That is, they are visuals that have columns of figures on them. They relate sometimes to accounting and bookkeeping, sometimes to other things. Here's one that's a very simplified one, by the way, and I think it serves as an example of some of the problems that are going on. Now, as you're looking at the visual now, I have to first of all raise the question, where's your focus of attention, by the way? Is it on what you're seeing, or is it on what I'm saying? You say, well, what difference does it make? It makes a great deal of difference. In a laundry list visual, you have people representing, for instance, the engineering disciplines that we're talking about. The first thing that they're going to do, remember the mixed audience? They're going to look, where's our discipline? And now, while their attention is scattered all over the visual, who's listening to what the speaker is saying about why we need to make, manpower estimates in the future, and so on and so forth? Now, this can be, by the way, controlled by what we call a build visual or a revelation technique. That's something we'll talk about in the next program. The other thing is, I wonder how many of you by now have added up the column of figures and discovered that the total is off by 1. This can be explained, but how much of what I've been saying is lost because that focus of attention was not there? Now, I'll admit, the size is all right. It has good visibility, it has simplicity, it has the clarity. The problem with it is to control the focus of attention. Now, if you want to see a real winner, by the way, in terms of these kinds of column data, the one that has to be the ultimate, obviously, is the computer printout. No one can see what is on one of these things. And unfortunately, it makes it very easy, by the way, with present-day equipment, to take the computer printout, make a transparency out of it, and use it then in a presentation. The audience has got to be sitting right next to the visual in order for anything to be visible, and my heavens, you have so much junk on it that where the attention might be is really up for grabs. Now, one kind of visual that is was one that you're very familiar with as engineers is the engineering drawing. Let's take a look at a typical engineering drawing. Now, in their normal form, they are about 33 by 44 inches. And this is a complicated size to deal with, so that we now have machinery that allows you to take an engineering drawing and run it through a piece of equipment that reduces it down to 8.5 by 11 inches. Then you can take that one and run it through another piece of equipment, make a transparency out of it. Then you can take that transparency and put it on another piece of equipment and then blow it up onto a screen, all right, the overhead. Unfortunately, what you get frequently is now it's still back to being 33 by 44 inches. Look, the typical engineering drawing is a working tool. It is not designed as a presentational tool. In almost every case that I have seen, with a few exceptions, by the way, the engineering drawing should not be used in a technical presentation unless the entire focus of attention in the presentation is on that one single drawing. And then it should be divided up. It should be presented in smaller units before it's presented in its totality. But remember the scale problems you're going to work with. You have to reduce it down and expand it up again. And the further away your audience is, the more impossible the engineering drawing becomes. What is more typical is, I think, the translation from an engineering drawing to what's called a line drawing. And the line drawing being some way in which you attempt to show configuration, relationship, proportion without all of the technical design detail. Here's a good example, by the way, of what you see in a well-designed line drawing. It still contains enough information to allow people who are technically centered to understand what is being shown. But notice how much of the detail has been stripped out. It's a kind of a circumstance where, from a technical point of view, you get a pretty good idea of what it is the speaker is talking about, kind of a generalization, and then still be allowed in further visuals to break it down into more and more detail. Remember what we talked about earlier. Generalize, specify, generalize. Here it is in the broad perspective, then get into the detail, and then come back out again. That's one of the things that the line drawing will allow, is the concentration on only those aspects of the configuration or whatever it is that you want your audience to see. The detail is left out. Now, the translation in part of the line drawing that has, I think, had impact to a non-technical audience is something like the architect's rendering. I'm sure that you have all seen architects who can show you exactly what a building is going to look like. They place the trees on it, landscaping is already done, and you haven't even started the thing yet. It's a way of jumping into the future. Here's a good example, by the way, of a kind of an architectural rendering from the PRT material. You have an opportunity to look at what a typical street scene is going to be like. It shows the guideways, it shows the cars, it shows the people. There's kind of a reality associated with it. Now, obviously, it is not engineering in the sense that it deals with detail. But there are times when what you want is kind of that broad, colorful sort of thing. And I think one of the best examples that I have ever seen of using all of the criteria for visuals in a single concept are the wall charts that are produced by large corporations. Here's one of a BWR6 that allows for cutaway. It has marvelous clarity. It has complete simplicity, and it has very high visibility. The color is great. Everything about it works well. And I know the reaction is, hey, that's for marketing types, you know. That's fine for them. We in engineering, we deal with the real stuff. I know you do, and I understand the need to do so. But understand sometimes the relationship between your audience and the material that you're dealing with. If it requires the kind of technical detail, use it by all means. But if, on the other hand, the nature of the audience, the relationship of the audience to the presentation and to the content is such, you might want to back away from the detail and try for the kind of impact and clarity that we've just seen. Now, one last thing I want to comment on in terms of visuals. We've got to say some things about hardware, because this comes up. Somebody says, wait, why not just show them the thing that you're talking about? Or why go through all this business of drawings or anything like that? Bring them the real thing. Now, that works out well. The only problem with hardware, however, is that, generally speaking, anything that is small enough to be handled or controlled by the speaker is generally too small to be seen well by the audience. And anything that is large enough to be seen easily by the audience is probably too large to be controlled by the speaker. And you get all kinds of complexities. I listened to a presentation once that was being made by an engineer at the early stages of micro-miniaturization, all right? That period of time when they had just gone into the wafer. And he stood in front of the audience like this, and he said, "Now I want you to notice the way in which it is etched," you know, and he went on here. And we got done with the thing, and I went up to him and I said, "You know, nobody could see what you had in your hand. It was invisible." And he said, "You know, you're right." The next time he gave a presentation, an audience of about 15 people, he brought in about 15 chips or micro-miniature circuits, whatever they were, and he handed them out to the audience, all right? That really worked out badly, however, because from that point on, he had lost complete control of the audience. One of the things in graphics that's always a problem is this thing of handouts. Do you give the audience things? Now some corporations that I worked with, and I'm very much aware of this, by the way, they tell me, look, when we make a presentation, the customer, the audience, whoever they are, they say, you will submit copies of your presentation in advance. If you're into that situation, by the way, there's not a thing in the world you can do about it. But if you can control the circumstance, there's a very simple rule about handouts. Don't ever hand an audience anything. You give them a stack of visuals, all right? Suppose you've got 25 transparencies you're going to use with the overhead, and you've got copies of those prepared for the audience, and you hand them out ahead of time. Now, you start on visual number 1. In a mixed audience situation that we described earlier, you're inevitably going to find somebody, you know, where's mine? Or where's our D? And they start flipping pages. And then, of course, since everybody kind of sits together, you know, when they have a common bond, you ultimately end up with about 7 conferences going on page 21 and then page 26, and then somebody else is on 15. Where are you, the speaker? You're still talking about page number 1. I suppose this works well if you have absolute authority over the audience, and you can say, you will not turn pages till I say so. But the odds are pretty good you're not going to have that kind of control. And what you end up with is distraction. And remember, we talked about it earlier, audiences do get distracted, by the way. But that doesn't mean that you have to provide them with the material for distraction. Now, I'm in favor of handouts being done on the basis of saying, here they are, I have them for you, and before I give them to you, I would like to present a few basic concepts, and then give your presentation. Now, when you have done what you want to do, when you've got the control of the attention of the audience on you, you've presented the ideas, then hand them the stuff. And if they want to use that as a set of notes, that's fine. They can use it for asking questions about details at any point along the line. There's no problem with that. But you have had an opportunity to control that audience. And the one problem with handouts, they're visible, they can be clear, they can be simple, they can do everything else, but they will destroy the control factors. Now, I recognize, by the way, there must be thousands of kinds of visuals that I haven't touched on, or at least examples of them. All I've tried to do in this program is to establish some kind of basic principles about graphics. We talked about why you use graphics, to understand the purposes of using them, so your decision about visualizing an idea is one that is made on the basis of choice. We talked about criteria. And remember, the criteria are not the criteria of the world of art. They are not even the criteria of the world of engineering. They are the criteria of the world of the technical presentation. The criteria are all based on the relationship between a viewing audience and what it is that you, the speaker, are showing them. The visibility, clarity, simplicity, control, these are criteria generated out of the process or the activity you're engaged in. We talked about the types of visuals. I don't think really thinks it makes a difference, you know, in terms of what type it is or how it's classified. Just understand that as long as the visual meets the criteria that we've discussed, then the chances are you've got a pretty good visual. But there's one problem that still remains with the whole area of graphics. How do you present it to the audience? And that's when we begin to talk in the next program about some of the tools that are associated with presenting graphics.